This is a Media Lab podcast. Dave, where did you get all this polyester from?
I don't know. You don't have this much How much polyester are we talking about?
I think any polyester is too much polyester. Why are you wearing bell bottoms?
Well, bell bottoms are back, baby.
I don't know. And I mean, I think it might just be a little culturally insensitive for you to be trying to grow an afro. I don't know. What is this?
Well, as in Korean, we call it a pama.
Isn't that a large cat? On a rinky-dink spaceship headed back to Earth, Kyle and Dave are stuck on board with an evil machine. This giant robot is forcing them to watch films it picks. If they don't obey, then it'll be the end of the world. Again. This is mostly Kyle's fault, but he's not going to face an apocalypse alone, especially not on this ship that seems to be held together with tape and imagination. This is Kyle and Dave versus the Machine. Welcome to Kyle and Dave versus the Machine. My name is Kyle.
I'm still Dave.
And I'm the Machine.
This is a podcast where a sentient machine was forcing us to watch movies in order to prevent it from initiating the apocalypse. And then another apocalypse happened. So somehow it's used its powers to transport us across time and space. So now we're on our way back to Earth. But the machine is still threatening our lives if we don't review the films it asks us to. And today we're going to be talking about the film Shaft.
Up yours! Get out of the way!
Cat say he gonna be here, he should be here.
Open it up.
Shaft's his name. Shaft's his game.
Cat say he gonna be here, and he ain't. It ain't right. Oh, wait.
I should point out right here at the very top, I want to give a huge thank you to Cole Young for making our new theme music that you would have heard at the beginning of this episode. He made it this 70s funky sound, so very appropriate for the movie that we're going to be watching today, but also for the rest of our discussion of 1971. And we should also thank our patron, Green Girl YYC.
Ooh.
Dave, what do you have to say about that?
You're awesome, and thank you for allowing us to eat today.
I think we have to start here in our discussion of Shaft, and I know you hate when I try and stop any letters from coming in, Dave. We're probably not the greatest people to talk about blaxploitation in and of itself. I'm an apologist that way, but we're going to do our very best. I want to start here, Dave. What is your history with blaxploitation, the character of Shaft, and then this movie specifically?
Almost nothing. I've never watched this movie. I think we all know, I guess they call it a meme now, but the character of Shaft has sort of made fun of, really, in the 90s. We know Isaac Hayes. We know the song. I've never watched it. And then as far as blaxploitation is concerned, I don't even understand yet what that term actually refers to. I think that my era, growing up in the 80s and 90s, the films of Black culture were more just your typical what became typical gangster films or comedies. But I suspect blaxploitation is a little bit more nuanced and specific. I'm kind of treading water a little bit. I don't actually know much about what we're about to do.
You should probably keep your head underwater.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of similar to you. I think you and I are going to be more knowledgeable about where blaxploitation evolved to by the mid to late 90s. Because, I mean, Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown is like a direct continuation of blaxploitation. If you've ever seen Do the Right Thing, Boys in the Hood, like those types of movies are, again, direct antecedents of blaxploitation. And that term blaxploitation, from what I know, again, and because like you, I don't think I've ever even watched a single one that came out in the 1970s, is that it has a lot to do with like the characterization of Black people in those movies, the tone that was set with it, the types of stories that were being told, but also the music. I mean, you mentioned Isaac Hayes. I think the music is as important as the films itself. So I think there's a lot that's kind of wrapped up into it. Again, similar to you, like I have heard the name Shaft. I first heard the theme from Shaft in a weird very white person way. In that I was watching the Academy Awards one year, and they like to do their little like tributes every so often, and it's like, let's give a tribute to the last 50 years of the best original song. And so then they had people come out and sing like When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio and like all these other like famous songs, and they ended with Theme from Shaft with Isaac Hayes coming out. And I remember there was like this dry ice, so there's like all this smoke around him singing from Shaft, and like people like freaking out in the audience. That was literally my introduction to Shaft. And then I've seen clips and stuff from the movie here and there, but I had no sense of like, is this well liked? Is this something that you goof on? I didn't understand like how it fit into the wider view of like popular culture and movies in general.
You also think that cheesinikin is the height of food culture.
So I'm really excited. Like, one of the things that I am so excited that we are being forced to watch the year 1971 by this machine is that I think I'm going to be crossing off a lot of these films and even looking at some movements in films I just don't really have any, history with, for lack of a better word. So this is great for me that I get to watch this movie for the very first time. I don't know. How about you? Like, I don't think we've really even said it on the podcast yet, but for 1971, is there anything you're excited about?
I mean, it would be great to get a grounding of what 1971 was like in North America. I think, I'll have to ask my dad. I think my dad comes to Canada in like 1972. So there's just a fascination with history. And I'm excited that we're going to hold hands and walk through this journey together, Kyle, learn about a dead era. As far as movies, I don't know. There's a lot of pretty big movies that came out this year. I think when we didn't look at the movies to come, the two movies that stick out in my head, that one which I owned for a long time, which was French Connection. So it'll be interesting to see if I still like that. I suspect not for some reason.
Do you know the connection between Shaft and the French Connection?
No.
Written by the same guy.
Oh, the book author? Oh, interesting.
Not the books that they're based on, but the screenwriter is the same person.
Oh.
So we'll talk about Mr. Ernest Tiedemann here in a moment.
Yeah, and whether Shaft was supposed to be a black person or not. But Clockwork Orange, which is frightening, because every time I've watched that movie more than once, but it makes me feel gross.
Weirdly, it's the same feeling you get when you watch the Muppet movie.
And I've never watched George Lucas's first movie, or first
full-length feature, as far as I know.
THX.
Yeah.
So we'll see. It's going to be weird.
Do you think THX has been released with THX sound?
At this point, absolutely.
It's been
recut. It's in Dolby Atmos. They've reshot it with new computer graphics, I'm sure, because George Lucas is a meddler.
He's a tinkerer.
Is
the nice way of saying that. You say meddler, I say tinkerer. He likes to tinker with his films.
They said tinkler, and I was like, he's not in a urinal. Yeah. Although you could say he's pissing on his own movie. No, sorry.
He's definitely pissing people off. So I'm excited to jump into this movie a little bit more in depth with you, some of the history of the film. I'm excited to hear from you with your penchant for not liking ultra-violence necessarily, how you take to what was ultra-violent in 1971. So let's do it. I'm going to thank some sponsors, and then when we return, we'll be talking about Shaft. Hey everyone, just Kyle breaking into the conversation to tell you about some of the people that help make this show continue to go. Nothing quite like a white guy and an Asian guy talking about things that affect the black community. I think we're the two best people to have this conversation. Luckily, next week, not to foreshadow too much, but I think there's going to be a much more rich conversation around some of these topics that you'll hear later in the episode. One thing I wanted to get out in front of here a little bit is, in a moment, you're going to hear a conversation about representation that Dave and I have, and our different kind of perspectives on that. One thing I don't want to get lost, because there was a point I was going to make and then kind of don't fully explain, is the idea of being gay or bisexual as compared to the Black experience, especially in the 1970s. I don't want to make it seem like I'm conflating those two things. I was more using it as my own experience, somewhat having an understanding of not being represented in the media that I'm watching. But what I don't want it to make it sound like is that racism is the same thing as homophobia. Both of them are, of course, forms of bigotry, but not the same thing, and they each come with their unique challenges. I want to make that very clear. Over a bunch of more episodes in this season, I think we're going to get really into that topic in particular. And hopefully, as we listen and you join us on this journey, we'll have a deeper conversation. That conversation will continue to be enriched with successive episodes. So listen to more of these podcasts is what I'm really trying to say. However, I should tell you that Kyle and Dave versus the Machine is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. The Alberta Podcast Network promotes and supports Alberta-made podcasts and connects their audiences with Alberta-based businesses and organizations. This episode of Kyle and Dave versus the Machine is brought to you by the Calgary Foundation, proudly supporting community needs for 65 years. When you make a gift to the Calgary Foundation, it's a gift that keeps on giving. The Foundation's knowledgeable staff will provide advice on the community's most pressing needs, keeping your interests at heart and helping you give back in a way that is meaningful to you. Your contributions are invested in an endowment fund that provides a permanent source of funding, allowing you to make an impact now and forever. If you're a professional advisor creating a giving plan for a client or a donor wanting to give back to the community, discover a wealth of resources at calgaryfoundation.org or check out Calgary Foundation's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube channel. This week, Kyle and Dave versus the Machine is also brought to you by Pod Power. With Pod Power, our sponsors are making it possible for us to amplify the voices of Albertans and Alberta podcasters. This episode, Edmonton Community Foundation is helping us give a Pod Power shout out to Glass Bookshop Radio. Glass Bookshop Radio is the official podcast of Glass Bookshop. Founded by Jason Purcell and Matthew Stepanek, Glass Bookshop is an independent bookseller in Edmonton, Alberta that focuses on Canadian writing with special attention to LGBTQ2S+ and BIPOC writers and the independent publishers who help to produce their work. Tune in to Glass Bookshop Radio for interviews with their favorite writers, publishers, and readers. To listen and read more, head to glassbookshopradio.com. Boy, I have a lot to talk about. I have you can't see this, Dave, because I'm shielding it from you over here on the other side of the spaceship, but I have written 3 pages of notes about this film specifically. But completely non-spoilery as possible, what are your immediate thoughts about the movie Shaft?
What are my thoughts about the movie Shaft? Number one, it's definitely the 70s. It's definitely New York.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely gritty, which I think will be a theme of 70s movies in general. I can't remember if we've spoken about some of these movie coding things and the implied morality of previous eras. You can tell that they kind of wag their middle finger at all of that and try to cross off a list.
Within the first, 30 seconds, you have Shaft flipping off a car as he walks across the street. So, I mean, when we were giving that context setting of stuff that probably wouldn't have happened in 1965 and now is happening in 1971, is whoa, okay, this is not your grandmother's gritty New York drama. It's
not as sleek and as well planned as modern movies tend to be.
Correct.
And so it has a real, almost, a B-movie feel. So if you're looking for something that's just going to kind of gut punch you, have some moments where you might laugh.
If I punched you in the gut, I would laugh.
And will kind of challenge your ideas about what people in bygone eras like to go to the theater to see, then you may enjoy steeping into this. And then, of course, if you're going to look at this from a socio-economic, racial, colonial, historical lens, there's a lot in here. There's a gold mine of discussion. Whether or not the movie itself is telling the most constructive narrative about those situations, we can discuss. Because I'm not sure if it actually represents something positive or not, but it's definitely a landmark event, and you can feel it, that it's very, very pointed. to rub it in your face?
In general, I think the discussion of this film can have like two different discussions, which is its place in like cinematic history versus do I actually like this film? I think those are two separate conversations that you can have. For me, and I understand now, having done some research on it, it's because of the very, very low budget this movie had and was given to be made, that there is the aesthetics that I'm going to say right now, I'm not a huge fan of the look of this movie, but they, had pocket change to make this, so I kind of understand. Versus the actual storyline and the dialogue that is being spoken in this film that I actually really very much enjoyed. Here is where we're at, Dave. As you know, we actually did a huge break in between when we went to watch this movie versus us talking about this movie, because I've spent some time with the Shaft franchise.
I just cut it there. I mean, you've just...
With Shaft.
Yeah, with the Shaft.
I went and listened to the audiobook of the original novel Shaft.
Of course.
I have watched this movie, the original Shaft from 1971.
Okay, yeah.
I've watched its two sequels that came out in the subsequent years. So 1972's Shaft's Big Score and 1973's Shaft in Africa. I then watched the 2000 film Shaft, which stars Samuel L. Jackson, which is both kind of a reboot as well as another sequel to the franchise. And then I watched the 2019 film, which is also conveniently called Shaft, that has Samuel L. Jackson in it again with another actor, Jesse something, and now I'm blanking on his name.
Existed, yeah.
Anyways, there's actually 5 films in the Shaft franchise, all that feature Richard Rountree at some point making a cameo appearance inside of it. So I feel like I am very well versed in the Shaftiverse.
Never say that out loud ever again.
And what's fascinating to me is the aesthetics question is solved in literally the very next year, 1972, when it's given like 3 or 4 times the budget that the original movie had, because that is like, oh, this looks like a movie. This does not look like something that's been like drugged through like dirt and grime and then put up onto like a grindhouse theater screen. I ended up liking Shaft way more than I thought I was, to be honest with you. And I think a lot of it is down to Richard Rountree's performance. I really do think that had they tried to pick someone else, potentially, tried to do even more with this story than what they were able to, I think this needs to stay on that ground level in New York City, pounding the pavement, finding the clues, and solving the crime. It all works for me. I just wish it looked better. And that's like me being, I feel a little bit mean, but it's like was this barrier for me to like fully being like, oh, I love this film, because it's just like, it's kind of ugly to look at.
It's funny. I think we're going to disagree for the first time ever on this podcast. I actually didn't like this movie very much.
Okay.
I think that like you said, there are core elements to the story which are very interesting and kind of fun. Yeah, honestly, at the end of the movie, I felt very confused. There are parts, I won't say that are offensive, but that are just so egregious in trying to state a point about racial stereotypes, and just all of that stuff is so confusing for me because I am not living that life. The not just using racial terms, but how everybody's separated into these like specific bubbles. Black people only hang out with black people, white people only hang out with white people. The Italian people are here. I understand in a topical sense where racism sort of exists, but in a movie it was hard for me to kind of mesh those things together. I got a little bit hung up on where does Shaft even fit in on this? Is he plays all sides against each other, and so it was kind of weird. There's some fun moments. I think it has easily the best supporting actor death of all time, and
you go on and on about him. Like there's a guy.
This
is kind of a spoiler, although it's in the trailer, so I don't find it a spoiler. The guy who gets shot, and then his hips like hang him up on like the banister, and then he falls down.
There's no way that was intentional. I mean, I think that guy actually broke his back. But
honestly, what this most feels similar to, because of another podcast I listen to, and I like to watch the films before they jump into their conversation, which I encourage everyone listening to this podcast to do for us, is I I've been watching a lot of bad 1950s horror films recently. The type of films where I'm convinced that they could only shoot the scene one time and they had to move on because that's all the time they had and all the money they had to spend. So like someone will, hit the wall and you can see like the entire set shake and it's like, well, we're just going to leave it in because we literally can't fix this. So we're just going to keep going on. It looks like an actor is forgetting his lines. That's all right. We'll figure it out in the editing process.
None of my lines are scripted.
That's kind of what this film feels like to me in a lot of ways, where it's like, this feels like a first take of a scene and not like we're trying to get this right. And like, we're just going to set the camera up and just let the scene play out because we don't have a money to buy a dolly to like zoom in and out with. So that's what I mean. It's like that sort of like aesthetic distance for me it prevents me from like being like full throated, where the next two Chef films are way higher budgeted. And then you get to have like some really fun stuff that happens in them. I guess to your criticism of the segmentations, this very much, and this is actually what, Black critics at the time, as well as even today, will mention about Blaxploitation as like an entire genre, is like, is this actually good for furthering Black causes? And there's going to be the people who have that conversation with like, listen, if you were a 50 or 60-year-old person in 1971, you would never have seen two Black people kiss on film. Straight up. It never would have happened. And so when you put that in perspective, like, let's actually show Black people being sexual with each other, that have actual love with each other, that can be looked at as sexual beings. I think there is a power to that in the context of film. There's also this idea of like, end of the 60s, into the 70s, with the Black Panther movement, of course, is riding strong. Vietnam is raging and stuff like that. So to see, again, a Black man who is confident what he is, flipping off white people and being like, no, I'm not going to take your shit, is in itself a powerful thing. On the flip side of that, when most Blaxploitation films focus on violence, drug deals, gangsters, that sort of things, like, is that really great representation? From another point of view, this actually is true for the Godfather films in many cases. Like, Italian-American organizations will often say, like, we don't really love mob films because it perpetuates the stereotype that all Italians are part of the mob. And in the same way, a lot of Blaxploitation would be like, oh, all Black people are either pimps, drug dealers, that sort of thing. I actually do think Shaft is kind of the exception to this rule because he's a private eye. He's not like the bad person in the film or that sort of thing. I don't know what the phrases I'm trying to look for here, but it's not in the same way as like another film called like Superfly is another one that came out the year after. Again, hugely popular, but it featured a pimp. That is what the main character is doing. At least in this one, it's like I'm fighting quote unquote bad guys and seeking justice.
I got into I guess an argument with Helen this morning.
How? On the ship? How did you talk to her?
FaceTime.
Oh, okay.
Because our bleep products still work in space. Because
that's nice.
That's
quality craftsmanship, I would say.
Yeah, not that we can name bleep by name, but that company, researching this concept of blaxploitation, where that term comes from and what it represented in the 70s, really made me think about what does it mean to be empowered and be represented. So the sort of argument started when Helen was asking me what I was doing, and I compared this to the recent film Crazy Rich Asians and this idea that is empowering for Asian people. And to our sort of private conversation off camera, and you sending me some information about intellectual criticisms from Black intellectuals talking about this film and that era, these problems exist where if you go too close to the truth, nobody gives a shit. You go too far away from it, then you get negative stereotypes. There's a balancing point where something could, in a narrative, be a good role model, not necessarily morally, like in this Christian rhetoric, but like, like an empowered person. I think Black Panther became a very interesting comic book character in the zeitgeist for this reason, because, he's doing everything that we want him to do. He's got moral ethics. He kicks people's ass. He's sort of anti-establishment. He's rich. He's good looking. That alone, like superheroes alone, that's a whole other conversation. So we got into this argument, and
sorry, what was the argument about? Like,
so
what
she
were the
was
two
saying
sides?
that Crazy Rich Asians is an important and good movie, and I refuse to watch it because I think it's just, in principle, it's a piece of shit. But she brought up, which is a fair point, that I have these opinions that I won't watch it. And in the one video we watched together about, I can't remember which director, it wasn't the director of this film, but it was an actor and director being interviewed by James Earl Jones.
I'm going to be leaving 2 links into the show notes this week. So the one that you're talking about is this public access show that's actually hosted by James Earl Jones.
So cool.
Before Star Wars, before everything. This is like back in 1972, so just after this movie came out. But he's talking with Ron O'Neal, the actor in Superfly, and then the director Hugh Robertson, who directed a film called Melinda, also 1972, but had been an editor and stuff before then, sort of thing. So yes, if you want to see their full conversation, I highly recommend it, because it's actually really fascinating to be a fly on the wall to that conversation.
Yeah, that one and the subsequent one with Charles, whatever, the professor.
Charles Woods is him. He's spent a career researching Black people on film. So yeah, he has a whole thing about Blaxploitation, what we think about it now versus what it was like at the time. So I would definitely recommend watching both. But
in the first sort of discussion, it brings up this idea of where do we get these defining characteristics from militants, from the white sort of lens, from artists. And of course, there's no right answer.
Well, obviously, it's from the lamestream media.
And so the argument comes because Helen, and this is to her credit, she says that I guilt people, I don't give movies a chance because I have a very strong, negative opinion about.
You don't say. I don't think I've noticed that before on this podcast.
And I'm like, yeah, that's probably true. But the comparison was when the actor is saying, when people from the Nation of Islam or people from the Black Panthers are criticizing films that we make, they have an idea of what a good Black role model is, but they're, a minority, very extreme opinion. But the regular everyday African-American in the 70s is living a particular life. And within there's so much variance. And so for me, I was thinking about Asian movies and, like, what's his name? John Cho has made movies. Steven Yeun's made movies. There are people that are making it outside of the Hollywood blockbuster, but nobody watches them, right? Like, they're not hits. They're more of these artistic statement pieces. And those movies were being made in the 70s too. Just nobody wanted to watch them.
And that's this internal, discussion, argument, debate that goes on, which is, do you consistently do that type of art that is outside the mainstream, that, yes, is probably intellectually stimulating, and for a certain class of people, this is, what we want to see, or do you work within the system and try and change it? And oftentimes the system cannot be changed, but this is a direct, this is released by MGM. This movie is released by MGM. Yes, it's because they were almost getting bankrupt. It seems like that's the eternal story about MGM. It's almost on the verge of bankruptcy, but they're well, let's just try and to make this movie that is basically for Black people, and then it's a huge hit and saves the studio, sort of thing.
Lions are very expensive to feed. That's right. I mean, they were already in trouble with their mascot. The idea of exploitation being tied to Blaxploitation, when this movie blows up, everybody starts making this movie. That's where I think culture runs into this poisonous echo chamber. And I have my opinions about social media and echo chambers, but I don't know, Kyle, this is unfair to say as a white male, but do you find that these conversations about needing role models and empowering things, as part of the LGBTQ community, does this stuff upset you? Is it something that you are aware of, or does it require some prodding from other people?
What do you mean by upset by? Upset that they're having the conversation, or upset that they don't have representation?
Yeah, upset that either they don't have representation or you don't see a representation of a character that you identify with. I think the Charles fellow brings this up. Growing up, he only wanted to have sex with the white woman, wanted to be a white rich man. That's how I grew up, because there's no Asian role models on TV. Mm-hmm. But is that, it's poisonous in retrospect, but I didn't know what to be upset about at the time. So there's...
But isn't that true for anything that gets revealed to you? It's oh yeah, like why are we doing it this way, or why are we approaching it this way? When you finally are kind of shown a different perspective, sometimes you do have to reevaluate. It's like, oh yeah, like why am I doing it? This is like the worst possible approach to this. I actually do have to approach it in the LGBTQ lens, because if we're talking about white representation, that is 99% of what I was given when I was a kid. Like I cannot even think of a movie when I was growing up that did not feature a white person somewhere inside the cast. In fact, like that's the recurring thing is like in Hollywood for the longest time, like you could have one black character, but two black characters meant that was a black movie.
X-rated.
Now, right? Yeah. So like you couldn't release that to white people apparently. But I mean, growing up in the 90s, I mean, that was like the biggest revelation, right? As a closeted kid, yeah, it was like not spoken about, or if it did show up on like a TV show or movie, it was either the butt of a joke or a tragic end. Like they were dying of AIDS or something like that. Like that is literally your two options: tragic death or butt of a joke. And I feel like that really started to change by the late 90s. And I talked about this story, which is hilarious in, thinking about current day. But like Roseanne, the show, Roseanne had such a progressive outlook on LGBTQ characters at a time that was very important to me, where they were shown as being, incredibly powerful, that their lives were not going to end in tragedy, that they could hold jobs, that they could have love being responded back to them. And I feel like that is only grown since that time. There is a bunch of, gay, bisexual, lesbian, transgender creators who are making content. And we've reached a point now, which is phenomenal, where you can actually evaluate them as like, is this a good gay film, and is this a good film? Yes, it has gay themes inside of it, but that doesn't even need to be the focus of the movie. It's just that there's a character that's just what part of their character actually is. So I think that is where it becomes important, where representation becomes important, when it's only relegated to a certain idea or, like I said, like a joke character, that you can start to get that internal hatred for yourself. And I think that is what the long-lasting negative impacts are, which is a long way of saying like that is what I've really enjoyed over like the last few years, because it seems, and this is just one person's opinion, it seems like there is a widening of the net because everything is so fractured online now. But it seems like this widening of like different perspectives, views, talents that I love to see, where it isn't just like this is a white person's perspective on insert social injustice here. And I think that's important to be cognizant of as well.
Yeah, I think we ran into this a little bit with Boys Don't Cry, and I think if we get to the history part, that Charles guy brought up something that apparently is a landmark history thing in the U.S., but I don't know much about it. But this Kerner Commission, and the idea that a committee of white politicians would actually be able to name that there is racial segregation, violence, and economic disparity in 1965, and then nobody gave a shit after that. But
I see nothing problematic with it at all.
So that leading into this idea, as this Charles fellow brings up, that blaxploitation films pick up because of this idea of a riot in a theater as opposed to on the streets. And so I don't know, is it better to have very extreme counterculture mainstream representations that trigger the next wave? Like I'm trying to think in the LGBTQ, like what a big, I don't know if it's Priscilla in the Desert, or like whatever these big sort of movies that are kind of hits that force people to challenge something. But then in hindsight, we're like, well, was that a good way to put it? Like people are hating on Hilary Swank for not actually being transgender. Like, can you actually say that?
I was going to say that's kind of the example that you're getting into. But even like early representation, like there's the original Boys in the Band that's in like 1970 or something, which features gay characters, which is almost impossible to find a copy of nowadays. So like no one watches it. But this is where I think, in part, why camp is so prevalent in the gay culture. Right? Because you can't necessarily have a character that's explicitly gay in your films. So you like really glom on to like the exaggerated personas of, say, Liberace or drag queens. And that kind of gets filtered into it. So like this over here is code for this character is gay, but we can't actually say that this character is gay. That sort of thing. Or else, like, again, mainstream audiences won't come because they think that is what this movie is actually about, when it's not. it's about something else. You can read up on this on classic Disney villains and how they're all coded to be gay caricatures, which is really fascinating.
No, I'm just harping on this a little bit because maybe one of the problems, it's an interesting comparison. So the campy, pantomimed gay character, but then, us who are not taking that as a literal representation of what all gay people must be like.
Well, yeah.
And so you see
that's
blaxploitation becomes, everybody who's rich must be a drug dealer, and everybody who's fighting on the streets must be a hard-nosed asshole womanizer. All cops are bad because they're all racist. There are a lot of things that come out of this conversation that are stressful.
Well, I think what it comes down to, and this was also part of that conversation with James Earl Jones, is we kind of use that as an umbrella term, but really there's a lot of subsections. We say black films or blaxploitation films, but not every single one of them is exactly the same or trying for the same thing. Same thing if I say Asian cinema. What does that really mean? Because there's obviously you can break that apart into different countries, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, but even within there's different stratas of film. So sometimes it's a nice catch-all term, but it doesn't really help with fine point conversations because every film does kind of need to be taken on its own. So let's do that with Shaft. So let's do some background.
That was quite the segue.
Shaft opened on June 25th, 1971. It is currently rated 6.6 on IMDb, 66 on Metacritic, and on Rotten Tomatoes, from 42 critics, it's at 88%. And then from 12,104 users, it's at 68%. So a bit of a divide between critics and, say, users. This movie is available on DVD and Blu-ray. You can also buy or rent it from iTunes, or, again, you can rent it from YouTube as well. A recurring thing that I feel is going to happen a lot here in 1971 is that there's not a lot of good information about box office. So this movie was budgeted at $500,000. So it was a pretty low budget film, and it would go on to make $12 million total. So huge return on investment for sure. If you account for inflation, that's as if a movie made $76 million today. So pretty decent for, again, a low budget to mid-budget film. Its plot description from IMDb is: cool black private eye John Shaft is hired by a crime lord to find and retrieve his kidnapped daughter. It stars Richard Rountree as John Shaft, Moses Gunn as Bumpy Jonas, Christopher St. John as Ben Buford, and Charles Coffey as Vic Andrazi. Anything you want to say about those actors?
There's actually not a lot of information. I think what's great is a lot of theater and acting training behind them. What's the Bumpy. I was going to say Bugsy. I'm like, that's Warren Beatty. He's theater trained. He's got Obies. He was nominated for an Emmy.
Yeah.
He's
just
good. Fantastic.
Oh, I've forgotten the actor's name, but the guy who played Blackula, the Black Dracula. So the guy who played Blackula is literally Shakespeare trained level actor. He is a phenomenal stage actor, and really the only work he could get was in B-movie blaxploitation films.
Richard Rountree is interesting. I mean, obviously, if you watch the movie, he started off as a model because he's gorgeous. He's got that charisma. He was in Seven, which is weird.
Yes.
Right? I didn't. So I have to rewatch it. I have to look it up.
He does show up in little bit parts here and there.
He's a 90210. That's weird.
Still working today. He still does little bit parts here and there.
Apparently, he had breast cancer.
Yes, he did.
So that's the thing, male breast cancer, which I just had to learn about. But he's a survivor, and that was 93. So yeah, he beat that thing up. I'm more interested in the director. The director's fascinating.
I think he would be, only because of his photography background that apparently he has.
And it wasn't just a photographer. I mean, he was a culture defining photographer.
Which I had no idea about. This is the fascinating part. Okay, let's get into that. So I have this short novel that I have prepared. So this movie was written by Ernest Tidyman and John D.F. Black, based on the novel by Ernest Tidyman, directed by Gordon Parks. So let's start with that Ernest Tidyman, and I'm only going to mention this because it becomes way important later. He was white. He was a white guy. And maybe because his father was a journalist too, one of his first jobs was as a copy boy at a newspaper. He grew up through World War II, but enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1946 in the Public Relations Department, then transitioned and was a journalist for 20 years, but mostly covered crime. That was his beat, cover crime on New York City. After that 20 years of being a journalist, he says, I don't really want to be a journalist anymore. I don't want to do it anymore. So he tries to become a novelist, a fiction novelist. So his first book, Flower Power, about hippies, hippie movement, that sort of thing, completely flops. Nobody buys this book. But his editor is like, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you write a mystery novel, but use the grittiness of your crime reporting that you know about and kind of marry them together? That would become Shaft. Now, this is where it gets weird, because from multiple reports and reviews that I've read, is that apparently Shaft was originally white. But the book you can buy right now from Amazon.com or .ca, or the audiobook that I happen to listen to, that is 100% not true. He is not a white guy in that book. So I don't know if it was like edited after the movie came out or what's going on there.
Would you say they might have George Lucased it?
Might have George Lucased, which is weird that they have this character named Jar Jar in it. It's a really weird addition and right halfway through the book.
I'm looking at these pages and they just don't hold up. This digital effect. Yeah.
But what a lot of people will say is that like they know of Ernest Heinemann from writing Shaft, and then they meet him and they're like, he's this dweeby little white guy. They're like, whoa, like how does that make sense? Heinemann himself, this is a quote right from him. He said, reading black fiction, you see that the central figure is either superhero or super victim. The blacks I knew were smart and sophisticated, and I thought, what about a black hero who thinks of himself as a human being, but who uses his black rage as one of his resources, along with intelligence and courage? So something that he did, which I couldn't verify if this was like super revolutionary for the time period, or like if this started a craze or what, but he does it what a lot of writers do nowadays, and he sold the rights to the book before the book was even published. So they started work on the movie before the book was out in stores for people to buy. One of the people who read that early copy of the book and pitch for the movie was this film producer called Philip D'Antoni, who hired him to then write the other 1971 film that he wrote, The French Connection, which would go on to win Heinemann an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. So even though he has these two huge successes in 1971, we have Shaft, we have The French Connection, he was kind of unhappy with the final products, especially for Shaft. He really wasn't happy with how it ended up on screen. So he became a producer, opened up his own production company, and then died kind of unexpectedly in 1983. Because of a perforated ulcer, just as his career was really starting to like really gain steam, like he died. So Shaft is like this perfect storm of him writing at the very beginning of what would be called the blaxploitation movement, which, fun fact, like we're talking about this huge movement, it only lasted 4 years. Mm-hmm. They really only termed like from 1971 to 1975 is like the blaxploitation movement. And there's other films that will fit that category through the intervening decades, but like the huge like 200 plus films that are considered blaxploitation movement happened in like 4 years. There's another credited screenwriter, as they said, John D.F. Black. From what I understand, because Ernest Heinemann had never wrote a screenplay before, this is why they brought John Black in to help out. Also, another white guy. So because John Black was knowledgeable in writing screenplays, he came on, helped shape the script up. But John Black is best known for his work on Star Trek, because he wrote during the first season of the original Star Trek series, and then came back to write for the first 2 seasons of The Next Generation, but really stuck to a lot of TV. So Mary Tyler Moore Show, original Charlie's Angels, Hawaii Five-0, Mission Impossible, all the big shows from like the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. Gordon Parks is your guy. He's the director, is a black man, and is credited as being the man who made Shaft black. So while they were in the script writing phase, he's like, I think this guy should be a black guy. He says, though, that his decision really wasn't necessarily there to impact the black consciousness, but simply to have a fun film that people could go and see on a weekend and watch a black guy winning. So he knew he was walking this fine line about making a film that was appealing to the black urban population, as well as white youths who are going to go and watch this movie. All that wraps up into part of the success of this movie is given to MGM for hiring Uniworld, which was a black advertising firm. And it would prove to be successful because Uniworld specifically used Black power imagery and terminology in its advertising, making it look like Black people had somehow like infiltrated the Hollywood system and had taken over MGM, which was like far from the truth. This is why in the trailer, it ends off with like Shaft, hotter than Bond, cooler than Bullet. And then however you want to term blaxploitation, this is considered either the third, fourth, or fifth blaxploitation film, depending on how you want to frame it. Talk to me about Gordon Parks a little bit more. Like, how did he shape photography?
Also, and I say, I don't want to spend too much time, but I will say this. He has that typical sort of impoverished background, fascinating story, born poor, and he's got like 14, 15 siblings.
And is he still alive or did he just pass away?
He died, in 2006. So not just,
okay.
But he was like 80 something when he passed away. His mother dies when he's like a tween, like 13, 14, and he ends up like homeless. And so his sort of adulthood comes through all these like random jobs because he grew up in a segregated town where he was told that there's no point in going for education because you're Black, you'll never make it.
Those sound like fun people to be around.
So he ended up working these flop houses, etc. And one of them had a library, and that's where he started reading books. And then he bought himself a camera, and turns out he was so naturally talented at photography that the developing studio where he was getting his negatives done, they were like, you need to take portraits. And some of his portrait work was found by Joe Lewis's wife? And this catapults him into this sphere. He's like working for the government, he's working for newspapers, he becomes a staff photographer for magazines. And his photographs are all sort of civil unrest, portraiture, celebrities, civic leaders. I mean, this guy is like in the forefront of all of these big movements that are happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which is, I only bring that up, because apparently when one researches African-American photography, he's apparently the only guy that comes up anymore because his body of work is considered definitive. I've seen some of the pictures online, and dude made fucking cool pictures. But I only bring all of that up because I keep thinking about that in terms of making Shaft. I mean, this is a guy that, if anyone understood the experience and political system and the environment in which he was being tasked to make a movie, it's Gordon Parks. Like he knew exactly what he was doing with the $500,000 budget. So within the constraints of what he was given. And so, when you brought up critics versus users, when you do the digging, this movie's essentially kind of a masterpiece. When you watch it as a viewer, it's like a B-roll throwaway action film, right? And it is a fascinating thing to learn about Gordon Parks in that context. And then going back to remembering what I saw in this film and thinking about, did I even interpret that scene correctly? Was there something more underneath that he's trying to push me with that I just didn't, like I couldn't even put my, feet in because I have no idea what it's like to grow up homeless in the 30s as a young Black boy. It's
like, I think it's just so hard for us to internalize how provocative and revolutionary this probably would have felt to a modern audience in 1971. Although I will say this, one of the things that I thought was incredibly interesting is like, we did an entire season on the year 1999. I don't think even in 1999 there was this many Black characters in one movie.
No.
Like, you know what I mean? So it's like, as much as this was like this watershed moment, yes, it definitely pushed a lot of like Black creators into the creative field and like inspired a whole generation to start making their own stuff as well. But boy, does Hollywood move at a snail's pace, like to try and get up to that same level that this kind of just did.
I don't even think it's Hollywood. I watched this one, I think I've brought this up before, but this sociological pattern of how slow social evolution actually is. So, any of these systems that we take for granted, whether it's religion, economy, etc., these are not overnight things. And I think one of the challenges we face right now is this entitlement to instant gratification. We want a movie like Shaft to come out and everybody just be woke and walk around and be like, oh, love, every piece, we fucked this up, everybody get together, equal representation. But that's just not how human beings are designed. So part of the argument I had with Helen was not really even an argument, became this discussion sort of cataloging, in our case, Asian movies. And as you brought up, in the mainstream list of where we pulled 1999, absolutely there are very, very few representational movies. But the late 90s also had a resurgence, I don't know if it's a resurgence of sort of cinema for Black people. And you get, this is where like the early 2000s, you get a lot of these. Well, I used to watch these movies in Scar. I just don't remember their names, but like where Taye Diggs and Tyrese and all these guys start getting their own films and building.
Well, even like
Baby Boy
he's
Friday,
become kind of a butt of the joke too. Well, like Barbershop and that kind of stuff too.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was going to say like Tyler Perry is often derided a lot, but it's like, again, he's not making movies for white people like that. And I think that's the pushback that he gets a lot of the times. Is like, these movies aren't for you. So like,
I like that he I can't watch them, of course, because I don't understand the context. But what I do like is when he's interviewed, because he's a very intelligent guy. Yeah. They just flat out say it. He's like, yeah, you think it's bad? I don't give a fuck. It's not made for you. We made $100 million because there are this many African-American or people who identify with this lifestyle, this oppression, that will watch these tropes and find it humorous, and everybody else can go fuck themselves. And then he'll be in Gone Girl, and you'll be like, oh, he can actually act. So
right, yeah. Shows up for like 5 seconds in Star Trek, and it's like, oh, okay, I guess he's here.
Yeah, and to that first thing we were talking before, our historic preamble, maybe one of the problems with humanity, this is getting very broad.
Wow, okay. Strap in, everyone.
Is the seeing is believing problem. So we create a film like this where we use an attacking trope. So we've got a drug dealer who's crafted by this Shakespearean actor, and he's so campy and he's so over the top and he's so cruel, but he also cries and he kills people. When someone just sees that, you're going to automatically create a box and say, this is what, let's say, a Black Godfather looks like. This is how they act. This is the only way they make money. And then the four rights, Black Panther-esque civil rights cousin or friend of Shaft, he comes off as super naive. He's broke, clearly sleeping on people's couches, but he believes in idealism. It's so weird because everybody gets compartmentalized.
If I don't compartmentalize, then how do I keep my prejudices?
But again, knowing that this is created by Gordon Parks, there's an intent, I think, in that to surprise people and to make people question where they fit in. But I don't ever think these are supposed to be literal representations. But I don't know
but
that.
I mean, talking in the year 2021, I do not look at this as like a literal translation of what was going on in the early 70s. But I do think it is taking the mentality and the feelings of what were going on in the 70s to craft a film that discusses it. I want to talk about 3 things that I noticed from this film that I was surprised by. One of them is an actual quote from the book that I think is actually transcribed really well, which is that Shaft is walking around and there's a little narration going on in his head in the book. It says, "This generation was white and weak, with no hope of withstanding the hardship of becoming human." And I really do think that somehow Richard Rountree really internalized that feeling, because I think he just suffers no fools in this movie. It's like, I am what I am, and if you're too weak to figure it out, then sorry. Which gets even more so in the later editions of Shaft. I felt that what was surprising about this is like how much this reminded me of like the very first James Bond film. Not in tone or anything like that, but it's like, this feels almost quaint in its like depiction of like, I'm fighting justice and like, I'm going to do that by swinging on a rope through a window. And like in the first James Bond movie, like Q gives him a gun. And that's what he goes to his mission with. And like, that's it. And then you kind of see like how that could evolve into like a huge franchise from today. But they talk about tanks and troops on Broadway if we allow these riots to go on in a time when we're recording this where, there was like insurrection that happens in the U.S. Capitol. So I thought that was fascinating. Lastly, I think we should have a whole conversation about the gay bartender. Because one, in the book, I got really frustrated because they use, and I'm sorry for a word I'm about to use, they use the word faggot so much in that book. I'm like, okay, we get it. In this movie, and I don't know if this was a Gordon Parks suggestion or who it came from, I actually think the gay bartender is actually pretty well represented. He is who he is. People are coming and drinking, and even swats Shaft on the ass. And he's like, whatever. Like, he like just takes it and kind of goes along with it. Like, I was shocked by that, to be perfectly frank. Because I see that bartender come up, I'm like, oh, like, absolutely. This is going to go, right. It's going to go like him calling him a faggot and then like shooting him or something like that. That's literally how I thought that scene was going to go.
Those are the moments I think that the movie entertained me the most, which is this sense of a lived-in world. So he goes to this dive bar to find that part's campy, like finding mafia assassins who are just hanging out. And then that's such a James Bond thing where he taps his friend, the bartender, switch places to like go covert and just figure him out. But like you said, even when he's in the coffee shop, and it's so weird, but they've got the stoned out hippie girl serving coffee, and she's just such a bad actress, but she's like not there. These feel like experiences that whoever wrote it, even if it's Ernest or whatever, they're kind of trying to show what New York was like for them at this time, as opposed to this, Hays Code-esque. New York is this Broadway and lights and everybody's wearing top hats and, living in penthouse apartments. Like,
I should point out that I am wearing a top hat.
With the exception of the 3 different tones of women he sleeps with, which I think is intentional too. You've got this woman living, the first woman he sleeps with is in this penthouse apartment by herself, waiting to have sex with Shaft. The second woman, I don't know if he had sex with her, but like there's a woman that looks like maybe she's his wife. And then there's a white prostitute that a gay bartender wingmans for him. And, all of this stuff's fascinating in hindsight. But during the viewing of it, I'm so caught. Even, what scene I love the best? The opening sequence of him walking through the streets. Not just he flips off the cab, but you can tell that that's not a controlled set. And he just walks out onto the street. I remember when I was growing up in Toronto, that was like a thing that was developing where if you were a city guy, you try to take control, you jaywalk, you just got to get to where you need to be and you don't give a fuck what's going on. But then when I moved to Hamilton for 1 year of a quote unquote university, nobody did that because in a smaller town, there's different connections, more, it's just a different feeling. Here, it's different again in Calgary. But watching that in New York,
when you're walking the mean streets of Yonge and Bloor, all right, as a young kid, you have to take charge of downtown Toronto.
I got that feeling a little bit when he walks in front of like the light's not green. He's walking in front of all these fucking cabs in New York City. They're 2-footing on their brakes, right? I think all of that's like candid. I don't think that's a planned shot. I don't think there's a stunt man in that car that's like told to honk at him so he can flip him off. There are a couple scenes where they're walking with him where you could tell he's just on the streets in New York. There are no extras. He's just, that's why some of the cuts are so raw because they probably just had a little, handheld camera walking backwards with him. And then they just use it as B-roll, right?
Just walk around New York, Richard, and we'll figure it out.
Side note, when I watched that show about Elf and I found out that Will Ferrell did the same thing, for comedy, that stuff's interesting. It makes it more visceral and less controlled as opposed to...
That's what it is. Like, again, I've already discussed how I don't really like the aesthetics of the movie, but I love the content of the movie. Like, Richard Rountree just has this aura about him that I was actually kind of shocked that he didn't really act before this, or at least not very much, because he doesn't feel that way with maybe some of the other actresses who appear in this film. They're like, ooh, probably your first movie. And one thing that I also love, I love any movie that does this, is like people executing a plan really, really well. Right? So like the chips are down, he's been attacked, and he's like, okay, here's how we're going to get this girl back. And he lays out the plan, and then they execute the plan, and it goes really well, and he gets what he wants. And what's frustrating me to watch the rest of the Shaft franchise is that that's never, ever addressed ever again, in that every other film essentially ends in a gun battle, where it's just like firing back and forth. It's like, no, like this is like what was really cool about Shaft is that he came up with a plan, executed it, and got what he needed. And yes, he can use his gun if he needs to, but it's more like I'm smart and I know what I'm doing, and seeing that expertise and understanding that he left the police force because he knew I can't get actual justice if I'm part of the police. I think that there's some of these fascinating things that we're still struggling with and dealing with in a modern context. That is, I don't know, this movie just has so much of that like packed into it, with the shell of it being, yes, like a grimy B movie.
At the end of the conversation with Helen this morning, one of the things that conclusions I suppose we got to is we brought up that we are revisiting the Fast and Furious franchise. And so talking about these role models...
Asian representation right there.
I mean, we watched 4 and Han's in it for like 30 seconds.
Well, I mean, and the director is also...
Yeah, he's Taiwanese, which is a country that last episode you didn't know existed. So all joking aside, it is interesting where we ask ourselves, like, why do we like a movie like Fast and Furious, Ocean's 11? And I think exactly to your point, when we're looking for role models, It can either be something we're intentionally chasing or something that reflects something about ourselves. So in this movie, that's another strong scene, this heist. It's essentially a heist.
Probably not as good as the movie Tower Heist, though.
I don't know if it's shot very well and explicit enough that you even understand what the plan is meant to be, because things do often go wrong. But I'm not surprised that in the subsequent sequels, they move away from that, because America also has this pull that what they want is gore, violence, and shock,
Right.
as opposed to intellectual sort of structure. And whenever you get like Ocean's 11 is a great example, the remake. It's fun, not just because it has the A cast and the camaraderie, but that is an obscenely impossible plot. Like, the heist doesn't make any sense. But of course, they're going to pull it off, so you have fun, because you're like, I wish I was that smart. I wish I was that good looking. I wish I could do that. So Shaft, you're watching it, and I'm going to presume that if I'm a black male in 1971, I'm like, I wish I could tell someone to go fuck themselves. And I wish I could like beat the shit out of some guy that's giving me, hassling me about this, that, and the other thing.
I mean, you could just start doing that if you wanted.
Pull off a heist when I need to rescue a girl. It's fascinating. But that's not the popcorn thing in the States. Popcorn devolves then into how much blood can I spill? How many bullets can I put into somebody's face? It'll be interesting too, if we do history, what's happening in 72, 73, 74 for those sequels in white cinema, and whether it parrots that a little bit just to try to make money.
I mean, I brought it up here in that I think that is what the interesting thing is if you try and compare these to the James Bond films, because the idea was that they wanted to keep making sequels to Shaft, and then the third one really bombed, and so they stopped making them. But I mean, we're getting into the Roger Moore era of James Bond, which is such a cartoon character, my opinion maybe, but I'm not a big fan of the Roger Moore James Bond films. But he's such an exaggerated character and so much less realistic than what Shaft is trying to go for, that it seems to be doing these completely separations. It's like almost trying to be like, hey, remember when movies were fun? Like, come to James Bond and have a fun time. And we'll have a sex scene, which is like Roger Moore kissing a girl and then fade to black. And then here, it's like, we're going to get explicitly sexual with our characters.
Butts,
yeah.
I mean, it's the counter culture, right? And I think when the reestablishment of the MPAA, but new codes come in because of these movies.
Yeah, there was no ratings for like a couple of years, and we're just getting back into rating films again. Yes.
The other thing I was thinking about when you brought up James Bond is James Bond, as much as they're similar, James Bond is still backed by a white established protocol. He's still a
100%.
rich white person. He can do whatever the fuck he wants. And Shaft gets caught in the middle because he's not a villain. He's clearly a superhero, but he's at war with everybody. Right? He doesn't have a support from the black community. He doesn't have support from the white establishment. He's got a network of support with his co-conspirators and his the people he can rely on, his network. But he's a solo predator, and that's a difficult thing to create new plots for. This is the problem with sequels. We should do a whole episode on the idea of sequels.
Yeah. There's a lot I have to say about the Shaft sequels, but we're quickly running out of time. I will just say very quickly, the third is actually kind of my favorite, not in, again, content. I just think it's the best made of the three films. And it gets into some really interesting territory of like with colonization and like, because he literally does go to Africa to infiltrate like a slavery ring.
Child slavery.
Type of thing. So it's like, it's getting into things that were pretty relevant, again, even to this day. And then the 2000 remake with Samuel Jackson is fine. Like, there's actually some really cool moments in it, but it's like, it's such a 2000 movie. And by that, I mean, it's like, you take this character called Shaft, whose theme song that plays in that movie as well, whose first line in the theme from Shaft is, "Who's the black private dick that's a sex machine to all the chicks?" He has no sex in that movie whatsoever. It's such a weird tonal shift from the other stuff. And then the last one in 2019 is just bad. It's essentially a comedy. They make it like a pure comedy that is making fun of millennials for liking avocado toast. Basically is what I mean. That's me being very dismissive of that movie, but that's kind of what that movie is about.
Avocado is great on toast. It's terrible when people tell you to pay $15 for it.
Right. Yeah. That's a different method. It's been an interesting journey through the Shaft franchise. Let me just say that. I
commend you and your patience. That's a lot of content.
Yeah. The last thing I just was going to bring up here, though, is kind of that bringing it back to the Vietnam question, or not even question, the reality that Vietnam was still going on and would be going on for the next few years. And I think that's going to impact pretty much every movie that we probably watch for this season, that we have to really keep in our mind, hey, we're in like smack dab in the middle of Vietnam. And that's, they ask him, what's it going to cost to kill this guy? And that character says, 10 grand a man. That's what the honky government pays. That's the that's the bonus you get for killing the enemy over in Vietnam, sort of thing. So I think
wasn't a reference for how much the family gets when the soldier dies?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, like that's what
a human
life
costs.
is worth, right? Is $10,000. And I think that is such
what is that adjusted for inflation, since you like to
Oh gosh, I have no idea.
Sorry, I'm just being a dick. All right, keep going.
But I mean, I think that that's one of those times where like that is such a great line that is so devastating, and I think for potentially a modern audience, it might not even make sense, or like they don't really have the context of why that is such an important thing to be saying at that point in time.
Yeah, and that's what we could try to do, although it would be a challenge, is get some Gen Zers or millennials to watch these movies with us. I will let you in on a secret, and this maybe will be off air. Helen had no idea who James Earl Jones is. So, your
wife is 20 years old.
So we are always within this box of people who take movies way too seriously.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So it'll be, like you said, it would be interesting for someone who's, let's say, if our friend Matt Mort watched this, would he catch and think about that line at all? Or would that just be glossed over into just the number, and this is how they got, negotiated some money to fund their caper? Those kind of questions are interesting. And there's going to be, on the flip side, stuff we miss all the time. When I watch modern movies, sometimes I feel so old. They're acronyms and like references to events that I cannot comprehend. You're asking me what Twitch is, and I have no idea.
That seems pretty sus, Dave. Pretty sus.
I don't know what that means. SMH is an acronym. I didn't know that. People keep saying SMH. I'm like, I don't fucking know what that means.
I'm S'ing my H right now.
Yeah, apparently that's a real thing.
We're done here.
All right, the machine has asked us to wrap this up. So I think we have to get to the two questions we ask every episode, which is, does this movie hold up? And is it still culturally relevant?
I think it only holds up because it's culturally relevant. So I don't like this movie as a viewing experience, but I think this has to be the longest episode we've ever spoken about a movie. I mean, it's so culturally relevant. It's such an important movie, but I didn't think that it was a good one from a movie viewing perspective. So if I was going to have Emerson with me when he's 15 to watch a film without giving me any of this history, I don't think I would choose this movie to watch with him. I don't think he'll like it.
I think I'm somewhat there aligned with you. I don't think that the movie itself holds up. I don't. Like I said, I think there's too many roadblocks in front of it. But I think there is a reason why it keeps getting remade. Like, right? There's 3 movies called Shaft that seemingly get remade every 20 years. And I think it's probably going to continue to get remade in some form or another every 20 years or so. Would I love there to be the character John Shaft have as lengthy of a film series as James Bond? I think I kind of would. I'd like to see like different adventures and stuff that he would go on. But I think our conversation about this movie in particular, even though I liked it a lot more than you did, I had a lot of enjoyment out of watching it. I think it's coming from that intellectual side rather than the emotional side for me, which I think has to be there. I don't know where that leaves us. I'm glad that you watched it. I had a fun time watching it.
Yeah. It's a bucket list thing. I will always have a lot to say now because we actually dug into it. So that's an important thing.
Dave, we'll always have Shaft. So
that's not the first time we've said that. All right.
That means we do need to get into our ratings. This is going to be fun. This is our first rating for the year 1971, which means this film, no matter what happens, is going to be both our worst and best rated movie.
Number 1.
So, number 1, no matter what happens. But out of 5, Dave, what would you rate this movie?
Yeah, it's tough. It's always tough after we've discussed it. So I will say that I'll probably be in a 2.5. I think cultural relevance, it's 4 or 5, but I have to drag it down because as a viewing experience, you gotta sit through parts of it. There are some really great scenes, as we discussed. But as a movie, I didn't really enjoy watching it.
If we're talking about the content, like I keep bringing up, for me personally, it probably would be up around like that 4. Maybe I could even convince myself to go 4.5 with it. But because of the way that it looks and like this really uninteresting directing style, which interestingly enough, Gordon Parks, who did the sequel to this movie, there's camera movements and zooms and like dolly shots and everything. So it's not like he couldn't do it. It's just like, I just don't think they had the funds to do it for this movie. So that brings it in, because that in itself is like a 2.5 for me. So I kind of averaged them together. I'm giving this movie a 3.5. So 3.5 and then 2.5, believe that's going to have an average of 3. So this movie is going to be rated 3 out of 5, right in the middle of the pack, probably at the end of this season. But like I said before, this is going to be both our best and worst rated film for the time being.
I wonder for this year, particularly because of all the tumult, can you use that in the scene? With Vietnam, civil unrest, etc. If we ought to consider having a cultural relevance score on the side in brackets, because I don't know if any of these movies are going to hold up very well visually. But this movie is a very
well, this is where I'm going to push back, because again, Shaft's big score made the following year in 1972. I think it looks fine. It looks good. Yes, there's grain and stuff, but it's because they're shooting on film rather than digital and stuff like that. But I'm okay with that.
I like grain.
So that's what Dave and I thought. What do you think? You can send any feedback to kyleanddavevsthemachine at gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter or Instagram with the handle KDVSTM. If you want to see the entire list of films we've watched and the ratings we've given, you can go to our Letterboxd page, which is letterboxd.com/KDVSTM. And if you want to support us monetarily so that we can continue doing this podcast and, eventually get back home, you can go to our Patreon page. There's a link in the show notes of this episode. You can support for as low as $1 per month. Of course, we do not want you to donate if it in any way causes you financial hardship. Something you can do for absolutely free is to leave us a rating and review on whatever app you use for podcasts. Dave, I guess this means we have to find out what we're going to be watching next week. Let me just push this button here. Whoa, that's a very long message. Next week, Dave, we are going to be watching Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song.
Great. The other half of the coin of blaxploitation. I can't wait.
Oh, blaxploitation, yeah. That movie came out before Shaft did, so we'll get to see maybe another entry point into this whole idea behind blaxploitation.
Let's do it.
I know nothing about this movie, so it's going to be fun. Like, I knew at least the general concept of what Shaft was. I have no idea what this movie is about, so it's going to be fun to jump into it and see what's going on. Are you going to make me a pair of bell bottoms then, or what's going on with that situation?
Your ankles are not thick enough.
Wow. I'm going to throw you out a window.
There's no windows on this ship. Wait, are we still on a ship?
We're still on a ship. We're on our way back to Earth.
Right. In a
Dave,
deep and
as I
rich
continually tell you, this is a deep and rich fiction that we've created. We're flying back to Earth, and it's going to take us like about a light year to get there. So it's going to take us 1 year to get back to Earth.
At the speed of light is what you're saying.
We're running at the speed of light.
Speed of light. Science.
None of my lines are scripted.